In the winter of 1847, deep in the Colorado Territory, a Sioux scout named Joseph Crow Feather would later tell his tribe that the stars themselves had whispered to him in his sleep. They spoke of a woman and 3 small souls lost in the wilderness, clinging to life in a place where death came easy and hope seemed impossible. What he found in that ravine would challenge everything he thought he knew about fate, survival, and the invisible threads that connect us all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Margaret O'Sullivan buried her husband, the sky hung grey and heavy over their small homestead near Bent's Creek. At 26, she had already weathered more storms than most women twice her age, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Thomas had been gone 3 days now, taken by the fever that had swept through their isolated valley like wildfire through dry grass. She stood at the edge of the shallow grave she had dug herself, her calloused hands gripping the worn handle of Thomas's shovel. Behind her, inside their one-room cabin, 3 babies waited, twins Sarah and Samuel, barely 8 months old, and little Mary, who had just learned to walk on unsteady legs at 14 months. The children didn't understand why Papa wouldn't wake up, why Mama's eyes were red and swollen, why the silence stretched so long between meals. Margaret had met Thomas O'Sullivan in St. Louis 5 years earlier when she was working at her aunt's boarding house, and he was a carpenter with dreams of claiming land out west. He had kind eyes and strong hands, and when he spoke about building a life in the territories, she could see it all clearly. The house they would build, the children they would raise, the future they would carve from the wilderness together. They had married quickly, packed their few belongings, and joined a wagon train heading toward Colorado Territory in the spring of 1844. The journey had been harder than either of them imagined. They lost their first baby during the crossing, a son, who lived only 3 days. Margaret carried that grief like a stone in her chest, but Thomas held her through the dark nights and promised her that better days lay ahead. When they finally reached Bent's Creek, they found a valley that seemed touched by God's own hand. Clear water ran year-round. The soil was black and rich, and the mountains rose like cathedral spires against the endless sky. They built their cabin with their own hands, cutting each log, laying each stone for the foundation. Thomas proved to be as skilled with his hands as he had claimed, and their small home was solid and warm. The twins came first, during a blizzard so fierce that Thomas had to deliver them himself, while Margaret gripped the bed frame and prayed through each contraction. Sarah arrived pale and quiet, but Samuel came into the world screaming with healthy lungs. For weeks, Margaret feared Sarah might not survive. She was so small, so fragile, but the baby girl proved tougher than she looked. Mary came the following spring, and with her arrival, their small family felt complete. Thomas would sit by the fire in the evenings, holding whichever baby needed comfort, while Margaret mended clothes or prepared the next day's meals. He would tell stories about the house they would add on to, the fields they would plant, the school they might help build when more families settled in the valley. But the valley that had seemed so perfect began to reveal its harsh realities. The nearest neighbors were 15 miles away, and the closest town was a full day's hard ride. When supplies ran low, Thomas would make the journey alone, leaving Margaret and the children for days at a time. The isolation pressed down on them like a physical weight, especially during the long winter months when snow blocked the mountain passes, and they were truly cut off from the world. The fever came with the first thaw of 1847. Thomas had ridden to town for supplies and came back pale and shaking. At first, Margaret thought it was just exhaustion from the journey, but by the second day, he was burning with heat and talking to people who weren't there. She tried everything she knew: cool cloths, willow bark tea, prayers whispered over his fevered body, but nothing helped. On the third night, Thomas gripped her hand with surprising strength and looked at her with eyes that were suddenly clear and focused. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper, "promise me something." She leaned closer, tears already spilling down her cheeks because she could hear goodbye in his voice. "Promise me you'll fight," he said. "Whatever comes, you fight. For those babies. You hear me? You don't give up." She nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. "I love you, Maggie," he breathed, using the name he had called her since their wedding day. "I love you and them more than all the stars in the sky." Those were his last words. He slipped away just before dawn, leaving Margaret alone with 3 babies and a world that suddenly felt impossibly vast and dangerous. Now, standing at his graveside, with the wind cutting through her thin shawl, Margaret tried to summon the strength Thomas had asked her to find. The babies would need to eat soon. The fire in the cabin needed tending. There were 1,000 daily tasks that couldn't wait for. Grief. She whispered a prayer over the grave, then walked back to the cabin where her children waited. Sarah was crying, the thin, persistent wail that meant she was hungry, and Mary was trying to climb out of the wooden crate that served as her crib. Samuel watched everything with the serious expression he had worn since birth, as if he understood more than any 8-month-old should. Margaret lifted Sarah and settled into the rocking chair Thomas had made for her when she was pregnant with the twins. As the baby nursed, Margaret's mind raced through their situation. They had some flour left, a little salt pork, and a few potatoes in the root cellar. The cow had dried up weeks ago when the fever struck, and Margaret hadn't been able to keep up with the milking schedule. Their chickens had stopped laying regularly, stressed by the change in routine. She had perhaps 2 weeks of food if she was careful, maybe 3 if she stretched everything. But then what? The nearest town was 30 miles of rough mountain terrain, impossible to navigate with 3 babies, especially with spring snowmelt making the creeks run high and dangerous. Their neighbors, the Hendersons, lived 15 miles south, but Margaret wasn't even sure they were still there. She hadn't seen smoke from their chimney in over a month. As night fell, Margaret fed the babies what little she could, mashed potatoes for Mary, who was just learning to eat solid food, and her own milk for the twins, though she worried it wasn't enough. Her body, weakened by grief and poor nutrition, was struggling to produce what they needed. She lay awake that first night, listening to every sound outside the cabin. Without Thomas, every creak of wind through the trees sounded like approaching danger. Mountain lions hunted these valleys, bears were emerging from their winter dens, and there were other threats, desperate men who might see a woman alone as easy prey. The second day brought new challenges. Mary developed a fever, not the killing kind that had taken Thomas, but enough to make her listless and uninterested in food. Samuel seemed to sense the tension and cried more than usual. Sarah, always the quieter twin, watched everything with eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a small face. Margaret rationed their food carefully, giving the children what they needed, and taking only what was absolutely necessary for herself. She spent hours staring out the single window, looking for any sign of help, smoke from a distant fire, riders on the horizon, anything that might represent salvation. On the 4th day after Thomas's death, their situation became desperate. The last of the salt pork was gone, and they were down to a handful of flour and 3 small potatoes. Margaret's milk was drying up from stress and malnutrition, leaving the twins crying with hunger she couldn't satisfy. That night, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She would take the children and try to reach the Hendersons' place. It was a dangerous journey, 15 miles through wilderness with 3 babies, but staying meant certain death by starvation. She spent the night preparing, gathering what few supplies they had, fashioning a sling to carry 1 baby while somehow managing the other 2. She wrote a letter explaining what had happened and left it on the table, weighed down with a stone, in case anyone ever came looking. As dawn broke grey and cold, Margaret wrapped the babies in every blanket she could spare and stepped outside. The world seemed impossibly large and hostile. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still white with snow. The forest stretched endlessly, full of shadows and unseen dangers. She had made it perhaps 2 miles when disaster struck. The trail she was following, little more than a deer path, wound along the edge of a steep ravine carved by centuries of spring snowmelt. Margaret was carrying Sarah in the sling across her chest, Samuel in her arms, and Mary was riding on. Her back, in a makeshift carrier Thomas had built for gathering firewood. The path was slippery with morning frost, and Margaret's attention was divided between watching her footing and soothing Samuel, who had been crying steadily for the past hour. She didn't see the loose rock until her foot was already on it. The stone rolled under her weight, sending her stumbling sideways toward the edge of the ravine. For a terrifying moment, she thought they would all plunge into the rocky depths below. Instead, she managed to throw herself backward, away from the edge, but the violent motion sent her tumbling down a steep slope, thick with brush and fallen logs. She hit the bottom hard, her left ankle twisting beneath her with a crack she felt. More than heard. Pain shot up her leg like lightning, and for several precious seconds the world went dark around the edges. When her vision cleared, Margaret found herself lying at the bottom of the ravine, 30 feet below the trail, with her 3 babies scattered around her in the dirt and rocks. Terror gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She crawled to each child, checking for injuries, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mary was crying but seemed unhurt, protected by the thick blankets that had cushioned her fall. Samuel had a small cut on his forehead, but was moving normally. Sarah was unconscious, and for one horrible moment Margaret thought she had lost her daughter. But then the baby drew a shuddering breath and opened her eyes. Margaret tried to stand and immediately collapsed as her injured ankle refused to bear. Wait, the bone wasn't broken, but something was definitely torn or severely sprained. Even if she could somehow climb back up to the trail with one functioning leg, she couldn't do it while carrying 3 babies. She gathered the children close to her, pulling them into the shelter of a large boulder that had tumbled into the ravine. Years earlier, the rock provided some protection from the wind, and thick pine branches overhead offered partial shelter from the sky. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But Margaret knew their situation was hopeless. They were trapped at the bottom of a ravine, miles from help, with no food and only the water that trickled along the rocky streambed. Her ankle throbbed with every heartbeat, and the babies were hungry, cold, and frightened. As the first day in the ravine stretched into evening, Margaret held her children close and tried to think of options that didn't exist. No one knew where they were. The trail above was rarely used this early in the season. Even if someone did pass by, they would have to look carefully to spot the broken branches and disturbed earth that marked their fall. The temperature dropped with the sun, and Margaret realized they might not survive the night. She wrapped the babies in every piece of clothing and blanket she could spare, keeping them pressed against her body for warmth. Mary's fever had returned, making her alternately burn and shiver. The twins cried weakly, their voices growing hoarser. As the hours passed, Margaret found herself praying more fervently than she ever had in her life, not for rescue, that seemed too much to ask, but for her children to survive somehow, even if she didn't. She thought about Thomas, about his last words asking her to fight, and she wondered if this was what fighting looked like, holding your babies close while the world grew cold and dark around you. On the second day in the ravine, something extraordinary happened. Margaret woke from an exhausted doze to find a small rabbit sitting just a few feet away, watching her with dark, curious eyes. The animal seemed unafraid, almost as if it were checking on them. More surprising still, the rabbit had left something behind when it eventually hopped away. A cluster of pine nuts, probably cached for winter and forgotten. It wasn't much, but Margaret cracked them carefully and gave tiny pieces to Mary, who managed to swallow a few. That afternoon brought another small miracle. A red-winged blackbird landed near their shelter and dropped a single berry, not much, but sweet and fresh. Then another bird came, and another, each leaving small offerings of seeds or berries. Margaret didn't understand what was happening, but she accepted each gift gratefully. The tiny amounts of food weren't enough to sustain them, but they provided just enough strength to make it through another day. On the third day, Mary's fever broke, and she managed to smile for the first time since their fall. Samuel had stopped crying and seemed to be conserving his energy with an infant's instinctive wisdom. Sarah remained the quiet observer, her dark eyes tracking every movement in their small world. But Margaret could feel her own strength ebbing. Her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size. An infection was setting in. She was dizzy from hunger and exhaustion, and her milk had dried up completely, leaving the twins with nothing but the tiny portions of food the birds continued to bring. That night, as she held her children close under a sky brilliant with stars, Margaret found herself talking to Thomas as if he were sitting beside her. "I'm trying to fight," she whispered. "I'm trying like you asked, but I don't know how much longer I can hold on." The stars seemed to pulse brighter, and Margaret felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever happened, she had done everything she could. She had loved her children, protected them, fought for them until the very end. But the end, it turned out, was not quite at hand. 50 miles northwest of the ravine, where Margaret O'Sullivan clung to life with her 3 children, Joseph Crow Feather sat by his campfire and studied the night sky with growing unease. At 32, he had spent most of his life reading signs that others missed, tracks in mud that told stories of passing animals, changes in wind patterns that predicted weather days in advance, the subtle shifts in bird behavior that warned of approaching danger. But tonight, the stars themselves seemed to be speaking to him in a language he had never learned to interpret. Joseph belonged to the Oglala band of the Lakota, though he had spent the last 8 years living between 2 worlds. His English name had been given to him by Major William Bent at the trading post, where Joseph worked as a scout and interpreter. His Lakota name, Wikanpi Najin, he who stands with stars, had been earned during his vision quest at 17, when he had spent 4 days on a mountain peak, receiving guidance from the spirits. That vision had shown him a path different from most of his people. While his brothers followed the buffalo herds and fought the encroaching white settlers, Joseph found himself drawn to the spaces between conflicts, helping travelers navigate the dangerous mountain passes, carrying messages between isolated settlements, and sometimes preventing bloodshed through careful diplomacy. The work was dangerous and often thankless. White settlers viewed him with suspicion despite his help, and some members of his own tribe considered him a traitor for working with the Wasichu. But Joseph had learned to trust the visions that came to him, and those visions consistently showed him that his role was to stand at the crossroads, helping souls find their way home. Tonight, however, the messages from the spirit world were unlike anything he had experienced before. He had made camp in a grove of aspens near Clear Creek, planning to rest before continuing toward Fort Collins with dispatches from Bent's fort. But sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, a woman with dark hair holding 3 small children, surrounded by shadows that seemed to be closing in. The vision was accompanied by a sound he couldn't quite identify, something between a whisper and a song, coming from the direction of the southern mountains. Joseph had learned long ago not to dismiss such experiences. His grandmother, Winona, had been a powerful medicine woman who taught him that the spirit world often spoke loudest to those who were willing to listen with more than their ears. He fed more wood to his fire and settled into the meditation posture she had taught him as a child. Joseph emptied his mind of all thoughts, except the vision of the woman and children, allowing the image to grow clearer and more detailed. Gradually, he began to understand that this was not a dream or a memory, but a call for help from someone in desperate need. The woman in his vision had eyes the color of storm clouds and hands that spoke of hard work and determination. The children were very young, babies really, and they were somewhere cold and hidden, somewhere the sun couldn't reach them. Most disturbing of all, Joseph could sense that time was running out. Whatever danger they faced was growing stronger. With each passing hour, as dawn approached, Joseph made a decision that would have seemed like madness to most people. He packed his supplies, saddled his horse, a sturdy pinto mare named Sunka Win, horsewoman, and turned south toward the mountains, abandoning his planned route to Fort Collins. He had no map to guide him, no clear destination in mind. Instead, he followed the pull of the vision, letting some deep instinct choose his path through the maze of canyons and ridges that cut through the Colorado Territory like scars on the Earth's face. Joseph had been riding for 3 hours when he encountered the first confirmation that his vision was more than imagination. Near a creek crossing, he found tracks, the distinctive print of a woman's boot, accompanied by signs that someone had been carrying heavy loads. The tracks were several days old, but they told a clear story of someone traveling alone with great difficulty. More troubling were the other signs Joseph read in the disturbed earth. The person making these tracks had been staggering, sometimes stopping for long periods, sometimes veering off the main trail as if lost or confused. These were not the tracks of someone on a planned journey, but of someone fleeing or searching desperately for help. Joseph followed the trail with growing urgency. His years of experience allowed him to read the story written in broken twigs and scuffed rocks. The traveler had been carrying something heavy, multiple things, based on the way the footprints deepened and shifted. There had been stops to rest, and at one point, clear signs of someone sitting down heavily and remaining motionless for a considerable time. The trail led into increasingly rough country, winding along deer paths that clung to steep hillsides and crossed streams swollen with snowmelt. Joseph had to dismount frequently to study the ground more carefully, but each time he found the signs he was looking for, a bent branch here, a displaced stone there, the faintest impression of a boot sole in a patch of soft earth. As the morning wore on, Joseph began to feel a strange sensation, as if he were being guided by invisible hands. Whenever he came to a fork in the trail, or a place where the tracks seemed to disappear, he would pause and listen to the silence around him. Invariably, he would hear that same whisper song from his vision, always coming from a specific direction, always urging him forward. Zunka Win seemed to sense his urgency. The mare picked her way carefully over loose rocks and through thick brush, her ears constantly moving as she listened for sounds her rider might miss. Joseph had worked with this horse for 3 years, and they had developed the kind of partnership that made words unnecessary. When Sunka Win suddenly stopped and threw her head up, nostrils flaring, Joseph knew she had detected something important. They were on a ridge overlooking a deep ravine carved by centuries of spring floods. The walls were steep and rocky, thick with pine and aspen that cast deep shadows across the bottom. Joseph dismounted and studied the edge of the ravine carefully, looking for any signs that someone might have come this way. What he found made his blood run cold. Near the edge of the trail, the earth was disturbed in a pattern that spoke of a sudden, violent fall. Broken branches marked a path down the steep slope, and at the bottom of the ravine, Joseph could make out what looked like pieces of cloth, caught on the rocks. But it was the sound that confirmed his worst fears, the thin, weak crying of a baby, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the pines. Joseph didn't hesitate. He secured Sunkerwind's reins to a sturdy tree and began the dangerous descent into the ravine, using exposed roots and rocky outcroppings as handholds. The slope was treacherous, made worse by loose stones that skittered away under his feet, but his years of mountain travel had taught him how to move safely over dangerous terrain. Halfway down, he caught sight of them. A woman and 3 small children huddled against a large boulder at the bottom of the ravine. Even from a distance, Joseph could see that they were in desperate condition. The woman appeared to be unconscious or close to it, and the babies were crying with the weak, exhausted sounds of children who had been hungry and cold for too long. The final descent took every bit of Joseph's skill and strength. The last 10 feet were nearly vertical, and he had to lower himself hand over hand down a crack in the rock face. When he finally reached the bottom and approached the small group, he could see just how close they had come to death. The woman was barely conscious, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, her face pale as winter snow. Her left ankle was badly swollen and obviously injured. The 3 children, twins who looked to be less than a year old and a slightly older girl who might have been walking for only a few months, were wrapped in every piece of cloth and blanket the woman had been able to gather. Joseph knelt beside them and spoke softly in English, not wanting to startle the woman if she was still aware of her surroundings. "Ma'am, can you hear me? My name is Joseph. I'm here to help." Margaret's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment Joseph thought she might be seeing visions of her own. She stared at him with an expression of such profound disbelief that he felt compelled to prove his reality. "You're not dreaming," he said, gently. "I'm real, and I'm going to get you and your children out of here." Margaret tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged from her parched throat. Joseph reached for the water pouch he always carried and carefully helped her take small sips, then used his finger to drip water into the mouths of the 3 babies. As Margaret's condition improved slightly with the water, she managed to whisper a few words that broke Joseph's heart. "My babies," she breathed. "Please, save my babies." "All of you are going to be saved," Joseph assured her, though privately he wondered how he was going to manage it. Getting 4 people up that treacherous slope, especially with 1 injured woman and 3 infants, would require more than human strength. He began by assessing their immediate needs. The babies were severely dehydrated and hungry, but they were alert and responsive. The woman, Margaret, she managed to tell him, was in worse condition, weakened by days without food and suffering from what looked like the early stages of infection in her injured ankle. Joseph had brought emergency supplies, as he always did when traveling through dangerous country. He had dried meat, a small amount of cornmeal, and various herbs his grandmother had taught him to use for healing. More importantly, he had a rope, 50 feet of braided rawhide that might be their salvation. Working quickly, Joseph built a small fire using techniques that would produce minimal smoke. He heated water and made a thin gruel from the cornmeal, which Margaret was able to keep down and which could be fed to the babies in tiny amounts. He also prepared a tea from willow bark to help with Margaret's pain and fever. As the immediate crisis of hunger and thirst was addressed, Joseph began planning their escape from the ravine. The rope was long enough to reach the top, but hauling up 4 people would require a system of pulleys and anchor points that he would have to improvise from materials at hand. While he worked, Margaret found the strength to tell him their story. Her husband's death, their desperate situation, the fall that had trapped them here. Joseph listened with growing admiration for this woman's courage and determination. "How did you find us?" Margaret asked when she had finished her tale. Joseph paused in his work, considering how to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "The stars told me you were here," he said finally. "I saw you in a vision, you and your children. I heard you calling for help." Margaret stared at him with eyes that held a mixture of wonder and desperate hope. "Thomas, my husband, he used to say that everything happens for a reason, that there are no accidents, only things we don't understand. Yet your husband was a wise man," Joseph replied, "and he would be proud of how hard you fought for these children." As the day wore on, Joseph completed his preparations for the rescue. He had fashioned a sling that could carry one baby at a time, and he had identified the safest route up the ravine wall. Most importantly, he had rigged a system using his rope and several strong branches that would allow him to haul Margaret up, despite her injured ankle. But as evening approached, Joseph realized they faced a new problem. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and storm clouds were gathering over the mountains. If they didn't get out of the ravine soon, they might be trapped by weather that could prove fatal. The rescue would have to happen in the dark, under conditions that made the dangerous climb even more treacherous. Joseph had no choice but to trust in the same visions that had brought him here, and hope that whatever force had guided him to find Margaret and her children would also guide them all to safety. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Joseph began the most challenging rescue of his life, knowing that 4 lives hung in the balance and that failure was not an option he could accept. The rescue began at midnight, under a sky so clear that every star seemed to burn with unusual intensity. Joseph had spent the evening hours preparing everything with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations in the wilderness. The rope system was tested and retested. The path up the ravine wall was memorized in detail, and emergency supplies were positioned at key points along the route. But as Joseph prepared to carry the first baby up the treacherous slope, he realized that all his planning might not be enough. The temperature had dropped below freezing, making the rocks slippery with frost. Worse, the babies were so weakened by their ordeal that even the slightest jarring during the climb could prove fatal. Mary, the toddler, would have to go first. At 14 months, she was the strongest of the 3 children and the most likely to survive the dangerous ascent. Joseph had fashioned a carrier from his own leather shirt, creating a secure pouch that would hold the child against his chest while leaving his hands free for climbing. Margaret watched with eyes that held both desperate hope and terrible fear. As Joseph gently lifted her daughter and secured her in the makeshift carrier, Mary whimpered softly, but seemed to understand, with that mysterious intuition of very young children, that this stranger meant no harm. "I'll bring her to the top, then come back for the twins," Joseph assured Margaret. "The rope is strong, and I've climbed worse places than this." What he didn't tell her was that he had never attempted such a climb while carrying precious human cargo in the dark, with lives hanging in the balance of every handhold. The ascent began smoothly enough. Joseph had chosen his route carefully, following natural ledges and using the sturdiest handholds. Mary remained remarkably calm, perhaps exhausted beyond fear, perhaps sensing the steady confidence of the man carrying her towards safety. 20 feet up, Joseph encountered his first serious obstacle. A section of the rock face had crumbled away, leaving a gap that would require a leap of faith across empty space. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a manageable challenge. With a baby strapped to his chest, it became a test of nerve that made his hands shake despite years of experience. Joseph paused on the narrow ledge, studying the gap by starlight. The distance was perhaps 4 feet, easily within his reach under normal circumstances. But if he misjudged the jump, if his hands slipped on the icy rock, if any one of a dozen things went wrong, both he and Mary would plummet to the bottom of the ravine. Behind him, he could hear one of the twins crying weakly, a sound that reminded him that time was running out. The longer Margaret and the babies remained in the cold ravine, the less likely they were to survive, even if he managed to get them all to safety. Joseph said a quiet prayer to his ancestors, drew a deep breath, and leaped. For one terrifying moment, he hung suspended over empty space, with only his fingertips gripping the edge of a rocky outcrop. Mary stirred in the carrier, and Joseph felt a surge of strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own body. He pulled himself up and over the ledge, rolling carefully to protect the child he carried. The rest of the climb passed in a blur of focused concentration. Hand over hand, step by careful step, Joseph made his way toward the rim of the ravine. Mary had fallen asleep against his chest, her tiny body warm and trusting, and that trust gave him the determination to overcome every obstacle. When Joseph finally pulled himself over the edge and onto solid ground, he felt a moment of pure triumph. Mary was safe. 1 down, 3 to go. He quickly secured the child in a nest of blankets beside his still-tethered horse, then prepared for the return trip. Going down would be faster but more dangerous. Gravity would work against him, and the accumulating fatigue would make every movement more treacherous. The descent took half the time but twice the effort. By the time Joseph reached the bottom, again his shoulders ached and his hands were scraped raw from gripping the rocky holds, but Margaret's face, lit with desperate hope at Mary's successful rescue, renewed his determination. Samuel came next. The baby boy was smaller than his sister. Mary but seemed to possess an inner strength that reminded Joseph of warriors he had known. Samuel barely stirred as Joseph secured him in the carrier, and he remained calm throughout the terrifying journey up the rock face. This ascent proved even more challenging than the first. The rope had become coated with ice, making it slippery and difficult to grip. Twice, Joseph's feet slipped on frost-covered rocks, leaving him hanging by his fingertips while Samuel swayed gently in the carrier. Each time, Joseph found reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, pulling himself back to safety through sheer force of will. When Samuel joined his sister on the rim, Joseph allowed himself exactly 1 minute of rest before beginning the third descent. His body was screaming for longer respite, but he could see that Margaret was growing weaker by the hour. Her fever had returned, and she was drifting in and out of consciousness. If he didn't get her and Sarah to the top soon, the rescue might become a recovery mission. Sarah, the smallest and most fragile of the twins, presented unique challenges. She was so tiny that the carrier seemed to engulf her, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. Joseph modified the sling to provide better support for her delicate head and neck, knowing that one wrong movement could prove fatal. The third climb nearly broke him. Exhaustion had settled into his bones, making every muscle protest with each movement. His hands were bleeding now, leaving dark stains on the rocks, and his vision occasionally blurred from fatigue. But Sarah's life depended on his strength. Holding out for just a few more minutes, halfway up, disaster nearly struck. Joseph's foot found what he thought was a solid hold, only to have the rock crumble under his weight. For several seconds, he hung by one hand while his feet scrambled for purchase on the smooth rock face. Sarah woke during the terrifying moment and began to cry. Not the weak whimper she had managed before, but a strong, healthy wail that somehow gave Joseph the strength to find another foothold and continue upward. When he finally reached the top with Sarah, Joseph collapsed beside the 3 children, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Every part of his body ached, and his hands shook uncontrollably from the strain of the climbs. But the hardest part still lay ahead: getting Margaret to safety. Unlike her children, Margaret was a full-grown woman who could not be carried in a sling. Her injured ankle made it impossible for her to climb under her own power, and her weakened condition meant that any rescue attempt would have to account for the possibility that she might lose consciousness during the ascent. Joseph had planned For this challenge, by creating a harness system using his rope and leather straps from his gear. The harness would distribute Margaret's weight evenly and allow him to haul her up the rock face like cargo. It wasn't dignified, but dignity mattered less than survival. The most dangerous part of this plan was that Joseph would have to climb the rock face while managing a rope system that required constant adjustment. One moment of inattention, one slipped knot, one weakened section of rope, and Margaret would plummet to her death. When Joseph reached the bottom for the fourth and final time, he found Margaret barely conscious. Her fever had spiked dangerously high, and she was mumbling words he couldn't understand, sometimes calling for Thomas, sometimes speaking to the children as if they were still beside her. "Margaret," Joseph said firmly, gripping her shoulders, "I need you to listen to me. I'm going to get you out of here, but you have to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Her eyes focused on his face with tremendous effort. "My babies," she whispered. "Are they?" "All 3 children are safe," Joseph assured her. "They're waiting for you at the top. But now, I need you to be strong for just a little longer." Margaret nodded weakly, and Joseph began the complex process of securing her in the harness. Every movement caused her obvious pain, especially around her injured ankle. But she gritted her teeth and endured it without complaint. The final ascent was a nightmare of physical and mental endurance. Joseph climbed while managing Margaret's weight on the rope, constantly adjusting the tension to keep her from swinging into the rock face while ensuring she rose steadily toward safety. Several times, chunks of ice or loose rock, knocked free by the rope, struck him in the head or shoulders, but he ignored the pain and continued climbing. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness during the ascent, sometimes helping by pushing against the rock face with her good leg, sometimes hanging, limp as dead weight. Each time she went unconscious, Joseph had to climb faster, knowing that her condition was deteriorating and that time was running out. 30 feet from the top, the rope began to fray where it had been rubbing against a sharp edge of rock. Joseph could see the individual fibers parting one by one, and he knew they had perhaps minutes before the rope failed completely. He abandoned all caution and began climbing with desperate speed, ignoring the burning in his muscles and the growing numbness in his hands. 20 feet. The rope held. 10 feet. Margaret stirred and looked up at the stars with wonder. 5 feet. Joseph could see Sunker Wynne standing patiently beside the bundled children, with a final surge of effort that drew on every reserve of strength in his body. Joseph pulled himself over the edge of the ravine and collapsed beside Margaret's still form. For several minutes, both of them lay motionless on the frozen ground, breathing heavily and marveling at the simple fact that they were alive. When Joseph finally found the strength to sit up, he saw that Margaret was looking at him with tears streaming down her face. "How?" she whispered. "How did you do it?" Joseph looked up at the stars that had guided him to this place, that had somehow given him the strength to complete an impossible rescue. "The same way you survived 4 days at the bottom of that ravine with 3 babies," he said quietly. "Sometimes we find strength we didn't know we had when people we love are depending on us." Margaret reached out with a trembling hand and touched his arm. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You saved our lives." "The spirits guided me here," Joseph replied. "I was just their instrument." As dawn approached, Joseph built a fire and began the process of nursing his rescued charges back to health. The children needed warmth, food, and medical attention. Margaret needed treatment for her fever and infected ankle, and all of them needed to reach civilization before their ordeal took a permanent toll on their bodies. But for now, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of a new day, it was enough that they were all alive and together. Joseph had followed the guidance of visions he barely understood and had performed what felt like a miracle. 4 lives had been saved because one man had listened to the whispers of the stars and followed them into the darkness. The landscape around them offered few options. They were traveling through a valley between 2 ridges with sparse tree cover and no obvious caves or overhangs. Joseph's knowledge of the area told him that the trading post was still 8 hours away at their current pace, too far to reach before the storm hit. But he remembered something from his childhood, a story his uncle had told about a hidden cabin in this very valley. A trapper named Hugh Morrison had built it decades earlier, then abandoned it when the beaver population declined. If the cabin still stood, and if Joseph could find it, it might provide the shelter they desperately needed. The search for the cabin cost them precious time. Joseph had only childhood memories to guide him, and the landscape had changed significantly. In 20 years, trees had grown, streams had shifted course, and landmarks had been obscured by time and weather. They were fighting the first flurries of snow when Joseph finally spotted what he was looking for, a wisp of smoke rising from a stand of aspens near a small creek. But as they approached, Joseph realized that the smoke meant the cabin was occupied, and there was no way to know whether the occupants would welcome strangers or view them as threats. In 1847, finding unexpected visitors in the wilderness could mean anything from grateful hospitality to deadly confrontation. Joseph would have to approach carefully, ready for either outcome, while protecting 4 people who were completely dependent on his judgment and skill. As snow began to fall more heavily, obscuring their vision and muffling sound, Joseph made the decision that would determine whether their rescue story would have a happy ending or become another tragedy in the unforgiving wilderness of the Colorado Territory. Joseph approached the hidden cabin with the caution of a man who had learned that survival often depended on assuming the worst while hoping for the best. Snow was falling steadily now, thick flakes that would soon make travel impossible and turn their search for shelter from urgent to desperate. He left Margaret and the children positioned behind a cluster of pine trees, close enough to reach quickly, but hidden from view of anyone who might emerge from the cabin. Sunka Wynne stood quietly, her winter coat already dusted with snow, while the twins slept fitfully in their nest of blankets on the travois. "Stay here no matter what happens," Joseph instructed Margaret in a whisper. "If there's trouble, if you're fighting, take the children and head back the way we came. Follow the creek downstream until you find shelter." Margaret nodded, though they both knew that in her condition, with 3 babies and a storm approaching, such a plan would likely mean death by exposure. But it was better than walking blindly into a situation that might prove immediately fatal. Joseph checked his weapons, a rifle slung across his back, a knife at his belt, and a smaller blade hidden in his boot. He had learned long ago that showing peaceful intentions while being prepared for violence was the best approach when encountering strangers in the wilderness. The cabin sat in a small clearing beside the creek, partially concealed by aspens whose bare branches created a lattice of shadows across the snow-covered ground. Smoke rose steadily from a stone chimney, and Joseph could see light flickering behind what appeared to be oiled paper windows. The structure looked solid and well-maintained, suggesting that whoever lived here had been in residence for some time. As Joseph stepped into the clearing, the cabin door opened and a figure emerged, a man of perhaps 50 years, tall and lean, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the mountains. He carried a rifle with casual familiarity, not pointed directly at Joseph, but ready to be raised in an instant. "That's close enough, friend," the man called out in English, though his accent carried traces of something European, German, perhaps, or Dutch. "State your business." Joseph raised his hands to show they were empty, a gesture of peace that was recognized across cultures. "My name is Joseph Crow Feather. I'm traveling with a woman and 3 children who need shelter from the storm. We mean no harm." The man studied Joseph for a long moment, taking in his appearance and demeanor with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about strangers. Joseph knew what he was seeing, a man who walked between worlds, whose clothing and weapons marked him as both native and someone familiar with white society. "Women and children, you say?" the stranger asked. "Out here in this weather? That's a story I'd like to hear." Before Joseph could respond, a second figure appeared in the doorway. A woman with iron-grey hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She was smaller than the man, but carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ezra, stop pointing that rifle at the man and invite him inside," she said briskly. "Can't you see he's half frozen? And if there are children out there in this storm, we need to get them under cover immediately." Ezra lowered his weapon, but kept it ready. "You vouch for them, Martha?" "I vouch for common Christian decency," Martha replied tartly. "We'll sort out the rest after we make sure no one freezes to death." Joseph felt a surge of relief. Whatever these people's story might be, they were clearly not the kind of desperate outlaws who would shoot strangers on sight. "The woman is injured and the babies are very young," he called out. "They're hidden in the trees behind me." Martha stepped past her husband and peered into the falling snow. "Well, don't leave them out there. Ezra, help him bring them in. I'll start heating water and see what we have for food." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Ezra, who introduced himself as Ezra Hoffman, proved to be stronger than his lean frame suggested, helping Joseph maneuver the travois through the snow to the cabin door. Martha, meanwhile, transformed the simple interior of the cabin into a makeshift hospital, laying out blankets near the fire and preparing supplies with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with emergencies. Before, Margaret's eyes were wide with a mixture of relief and apprehension as Joseph helped her down from Sunkerwind's back. She clutched Mary protectively while studying their unexpected hosts, clearly wondering what kind of people they had stumbled upon. Come in," Martha said warmly, taking charge with the natural authority of a woman accustomed to caring for others. "You look half dead, dear. Ezra, bring those babies inside before they catch their death." The cabin's interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, plus what looked like a small sleeping chamber beyond a curtained doorway. The furnishings were simple but well made, and the walls were lined with shelves holding books, tools, and various supplies that spoke of people who had planned for a long stay in isolation. As Margaret settled into a chair near the fire with Mary on her lap, Martha began fussing over the twins with the practiced movements of someone who had cared for infants before. "These little ones are too thin," she observed, examining Samuel with gentle hands. "When did they last have a proper meal?" "It's been several days," Margaret admitted, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion. We had some difficulties." Ezra caught Joseph's eye and nodded toward a corner of the room where they could speak privately. "What's the real story here?" he asked quietly. "Woman alone with 3 babies in the middle of nowhere, traveling with a Sioux scout in a snowstorm, that's not something you see every day." Joseph gave him a condensed version of events, starting with Margaret's husband's death and ending with the rescue from the ravine. Ezra listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as the tale unfolded. "Jesus and Mary," Ezra breathed when Joseph finished. 4 days at the bottom of Whispering Creek Canyon with 3 babies. How did she keep them alive?" "Strength." "I didn't know existed," Joseph replied simply. "And maybe some help from forces we don't understand." While the men talked, Martha had taken charge of the immediate medical needs. She examined Margaret's ankle with competent hands, applied a poultice that smelled of herbs and pine sap, and rewrapped it with clean cloth. The twins were fed with warm milk, diluted with water and sweetened with honey, while Mary received small spoonfuls of stew that Martha had warmed over the fire. "Your fever's broken, but you're still weak as a newborn colt," Martha informed Margaret. As she worked, "You'll need rest and proper food for at least a week before you should even think about traveling again." Margaret's face showed panic at the suggestion. "We can't impose on you for that long. We have no money to pay for—" "Nonsense," Martha interrupted firmly. "We don't see another human soul for months at a time out here. Having visitors, especially little ones, is a gift, not a burden." Ezra returned from his conversation with Joseph and settled into a chair beside his wife. "Martha, they need more than just a few days of shelter. This woman's lost everything: husband, home, means of support. She needs a fresh start." Margaret looked between her unexpected hosts with growing confusion. "I don't understand. Who are you people? What are you doing out here?" Martha and Ezra exchanged a look that spoke of shared history and difficult decisions. It was Martha who answered. "We're what you might call refugees ourselves," she said slowly. "Ezra was a doctor in Pennsylvania before we came west. I was a midwife and healer. We had a good life, a successful practice in Philadelphia." "What happened?" Margaret asked gently. Ezra's face darkened with old pain. "Cholera epidemic in 1844. We lost our 2 children, a boy and a girl, despite everything we knew about medicine. After that, we couldn't bear to stay in a place with so many memories. We came west to start over," Martha continued, "found this place and decided it was far enough from everything that had hurt us. Ezra still practices medicine when needed, treats trappers, trading parties, anyone who comes through with injuries or sickness. I help with births and healing. It's a simple life, but it's peaceful." Margaret felt tears welling up as she recognized the echo of her own loss in their story. "I'm so sorry. Losing children, the hardest thing in the world," Martha agreed. "But sometimes, if we're lucky, life gives us second chances." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of horses and voices approaching. Through the storm, Ezra immediately reached for his rifle, while Joseph moved to a position where he could see out the window. "3 riders," Joseph reported quietly, "armed, moving carefully. They're following our trail." Margaret's face went pale. Who would be following us? Joseph had been wondering the same thing. Their journey had taken them through an isolated country where encounters with other travelers should have been unlikely. The fact that armed men were tracking them suggested either remarkable coincidence or something more sinister. "Could be anyone," Ezra said grimly. "Bandits who saw us take you in, bounty hunters looking for someone they think you might be, or just men who figure a woman alone with children makes for easy pickings." The riders were close enough now that their voices could be heard over the wind and snow. Joseph strained to make out words, but the storm muffled everything except the general tone: urgent, aggressive, predatory. "Martha, take the woman and children into the back room," Ezra ordered. "Joseph, you know this country better than I do. What are our options?" Joseph studied the situation with the tactical thinking that had kept him alive through numerous dangerous encounters. The cabin was defensible but not impregnable. 3 armed men could eventually force their way in, especially if they were willing to burn the building. But the storm that had driven them to seek shelter was also their ally. It would make sustained siege difficult and limit the attackers' mobility. "We make a stand here," Joseph decided. "The storm is getting worse, and they won't want to spend all night in the open. If we can convince them the cost is too high, they might move on." As footsteps approached the cabin door, Joseph and Ezra took positions on either side of the windows, weapons ready. Whatever these strangers wanted, they would soon discover that their intended victims were neither helpless nor unprotected. The pounding on the door, when it came, was aggressive and demanding, the sound of men who expected immediate compliance with their wishes. But inside the cabin, 4 adults prepared to defend 3 innocent children against whatever threat the storm had brought to their door. The pounding on the cabin door continued with increasing violence, each blow echoing through the small space. Like a war drum, Joseph pressed himself against the wall beside the window, rifle ready, while Ezra took position near the door with his weapon trained on the wooden barrier that separated them from unknown danger. "Open up!" a harsh voice shouted, through the storm. "We know you got people in there. We've seen the horses, the tracks. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." In the back room, Margaret clutched her children close, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. Martha sat beside her, one hand resting protectively on Sarah's tiny form, her face set in lines of grim determination. Despite having just met these strangers hours earlier, she was clearly prepared to defend them with her life. Joseph caught Ezra's eye and made a series of hand gestures, military signals he had learned during his time guiding cavalry units through hostile territory. 3 men outside, positioned at door and both windows, probably more weapons than the 2 they could see. Ezra nodded his understanding, his medical training having given him enough battlefield experience to read tactical situations. "What do you want?" Ezra called out, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air. "We're looking for someone," came the reply. "Woman with 3 kids. Word is they might have passed through here with an Indian scout. You seen anything like that?" Joseph felt ice form in his stomach. These men weren't random bandits or opportunistic thieves. They were specifically hunting Margaret and her children, which meant someone had put them on the trail. But who would want to track down a widow with babies? And why? "Don't know what you're talking about," Ezra responded. "Just me and my wife here, riding out the storm." The sound of muffled conversation outside suggested the strangers were conferring about their next move. Joseph used the momentary pause to study what he could see through the frost-covered window. 2 men were visible, both wearing heavy coats and carrying repeating rifles, expensive weapons that suggested these weren't desperate drifters, but professionals hired for a specific job. "We ain't stupid, old man," the voice called again. More aggressive now. "We can see horse tracks leading right to your door, fresh tracks made today. And that traveway drag mark ain't something you see every day." Joseph cursed silently. In his urgency to get Margaret and the children to shelter, he had been careless about concealing their trail. Any experienced tracker would be able to read the story, written in the snow and disturbed earth around the cabin. "Maybe some travelers stopped by earlier," Ezra said, playing for time. "Storm's been driving folks to seek shelter wherever they can find it." "Then you won't mind if we come in and have a look around," the voice replied. But it wasn't really a question. "Make sure you ain't harboring nobody you shouldn't be." The demand was followed by the sound of footsteps moving around the cabin. The strangers were positioning themselves to storm the building from multiple directions. Joseph recognized the tactical pattern and knew they had perhaps minutes before the attack began. He made a quick decision that went against every principle of caution he had learned in years of dangerous work. Stepping away from the window, Joseph moved to the door and began sliding back the heavy wooden bar that secured it. "What are you doing?" Ezra hissed, but Joseph was already pulling the door open. Joseph stepped into the swirling snow, with his hands raised but clearly visible on his rifle. The 3 strangers were spread around the cabin as he had expected, 2 flanking the building, while the 3rd remained at the door. They were all armed and dangerous-looking, but Joseph noted details that might be useful. The leader was favoring his left leg, possibly from an old injury. The man at the east window was young and nervous, likely to make mistakes under pressure. The 3rd was older and moved with the confidence of an experienced gunfighter. "I'm Joseph Crow Feather," he announced calmly. "You said you were looking for me." The leader, a heavy-set man with graying beard and cold eyes, stepped forward with his rifle trained on Joseph's chest. "So you are here? Where's the woman and the kids?" "Safe," Joseph replied. "Who wants to know?" "Name's Wade Garrett." I got a client back in St. Louis who's real interested in talking to Mrs. Margaret O'Sullivan about some property that might belong to him now that her husband's dead. Joseph felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Someone in St. Louis, probably a creditor or business partner, had learned of Thomas O'Sullivan's death and decided that his widow and children represented either an opportunity or a threat that needed to be handled personally. Property, Joseph asked, buying time while he assessed the tactical situation. Her husband owed money to the wrong people, Garrett explained with a predatory smile. Signed some papers that made his family responsible for his debts. My client figures the woman and kids can work off what's owed. The euphemism didn't fool Joseph. Garrett was talking about slavery in all but name, forcing Margaret and her children into indentured servitude that would likely last until the children were grown or dead. It was a common enough practice on the frontier, where law enforcement was scarce and desperate people often signed contracts they didn't fully understand. The woman's injured, Joseph said. Children are sick. They're not going anywhere in this storm. Then we'll wait, Garrett replied. Storm can't last forever, but I got orders to bring them back one way or another. Behind Garrett, the younger man was shifting nervously from foot to foot, his weapon wavering as he tried to keep both Joseph and the cabin under observation. The older gunfighter remained motionless, but Joseph could see the calculation in his eyes. He was measuring distances, angles, looking for the best position to end this confrontation quickly. Your client know these people nearly died getting this far? Joseph asked. Know that the woman just lost her husband, that the children are barely old enough to walk? That ain't my concern, Garrett said coldly. I got a job to do and I aim to do it. Joseph made another tactical decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of reaching for his weapon or diving for cover, he began to speak in Lakota, his voice carrying clearly through the swirling snow. The words were part prayer, part challenge, part statement of intent. Joseph was calling on his ancestors, on the spirits that had guided him to find Margaret and her children, and on the sacred responsibility he had accepted when he chose to rescue them from certain death. But the practical effect of his words was more immediate. The three gunmen didn't understand Lakota, but they recognized the tone and cadence of a warrior preparing for battle. More importantly, they couldn't be sure whether Joseph was speaking to spirits or signaling to other armed men hidden in the forest around them. Shut up with that savage talk, Garrett snarled, but Joseph could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. I'm telling my ancestors that 3 armed men are threatening a woman and children under my protection, Joseph said calmly, switching back to English. I'm asking them to witness what happens next and to guide the spirits of any men who die. Here to the judgment they deserve. The psychological warfare was working. The younger gunman was looking around nervously, clearly spooked by the idea that hostile warriors might be watching from the shadows. Even the experienced gunfighter seemed less confident, his eyes scanning the tree line for threats that might or might not exist. But Garrett was made of sterner stuff. I don't care if you got the whole damn Sioux nation hiding in them trees, he growled. I got a job to finish. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by an unexpected intervention. From inside the cabin came the sound of Mary's voice, clear and frightened, calling for her mother. "Mama! Mama! I'm scared!" The sound of the child's distress seemed to galvanize everyone simultaneously. Garrett started forward, intent on reaching the source of the voice. Joseph moved to intercept him. The other 2 gunmen raised their weapons, preparing to support their leader, and from the cabin door, Ezra Hoffman emerged with his rifle trained on Garrett's chest. That's far enough, the doctor said quietly. I've taken an oath to do no harm, but I'll make an exception for men who threaten children. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. 5 armed men in a confined space, with innocent lives hanging in the balance, and a storm providing cover for violence that might never be investigated or punished. It was Martha who provided the decisive intervention. She appeared in the doorway, behind her husband, not with a weapon but with Sarah, one of the twins, cradled in her arms. "Look at her," Martha said, her voice carrying clearly through the snow. "Look at this baby and tell me what threat she poses to anyone." Sarah was awake, her large dark eyes studying the scene, with the solemn attention of an infant trying to understand the adult world. She was clearly still weak from their ordeal, still fragile despite the care she had received. "She's 8 months old," Martha continued. "She nearly died of starvation and exposure. Her brother and sister aren't much better off. Their mother gave everything she had to keep them alive. What kind of men hunt babies through a blizzard? The moral weight of—" Martha's words hit the younger gunman like a physical blow. Joseph could see him wavering, his weapon dropping slightly as he stared at the tiny child in the doorway. But Garrett remained unmoved. "Business is business," he said harshly. "That baby and her family represent money to my client. I aim to collect." "Over my dead body," Ezra said simply. "That can be arranged." The older gunfighter spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. Joseph realized that words had reached their limit. Violence was now inevitable, and the only question was who would survive it. He began calculating odds, angles, priorities. Garrett was the leader and the primary threat. The older gunfighter was the most dangerous. The young one might be turned, or at least neutralized without killing. But before anyone could make the first fatal move, a new sound cut through the storm, the howling of wolves, close and getting closer. The sound was unmistakable and terrifying. Wolves in winter were desperate, creatures driven by hunger to take risks they would normally avoid. A pack that had caught the scent of horses and humans might be bold enough to attack, especially if they sensed weakness or fear. Garrett's expression changed as he recognized the new threat. Wolves were a danger that transcended human conflicts. They would kill anyone they could catch, regardless of which side of a gunfight that person had been on. "We need to get inside," the young gunman said, his voice tight with fear. "All of us. Wolves won't attack a group in a defensible position, but out here in the open—" Joseph seized the moment of uncertainty. "Your choice, Garrett. You can keep this fight going and let the wolves finish whoever's left standing, or we can all survive the night and settle this when the storm passes." The howling came again, closer now and from multiple directions. The pack had definitely caught their scent and was moving in for a closer look. Garrett's face twisted with frustration, but survival instinct was stronger than greed. "Inside," he ordered his men. "But this ain't over. Come morning, we finish what we started." As 6 armed men and 1 terrified family crowded into a cabin built for 2 people, Joseph wondered if he had just saved their lives or simply postponed their deaths until dawn. The cabin that had seemed spacious enough for 2 people now felt suffocating with 9 souls crammed inside its log walls. The air grew thick with tension, wood smoke, and the mingled scents of fear and unwashed bodies. Outside, the wolves prowled the perimeter, their occasional howls serving as a grim reminder that death waited just beyond the thin barrier of wooden walls. Joseph positioned himself near the fireplace where he could watch both the bounty hunters and the doors. Garrett and his men had claimed the area near the main entrance, their weapons within easy reach, despite the temporary truce. The older gunfighter, who had introduced himself only as Coleman, sat with his back against the wall, his pale eyes constantly scanning the room like a predator, waiting for weakness to reveal itself. Margaret emerged from the back room, where she had been hiding with the children, her face pale but determined. She carried Mary while Martha followed with the twins, both women moving with the careful precision of people trying not to trigger violence through sudden movements. "So you're the famous Mrs. O'Sullivan," Garrett said, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been admiration. "You've led us quite a chase through some mighty rough country." Margaret lifted her chin with a dignity that her circumstances couldn't diminish. "I don't know what you think my husband owed, but we have nothing left to give anyone. Thomas is dead, our home is gone, and these children need medical attention, not whatever justice you think you're bringing." "Justice ain't what this is about," Garrett replied with a cold smile. "Your husband signed papers with Cyrus Blackwood in St. Louis, papers that made you and your children responsible for his gambling debts if anything happened to him." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Joseph saw her stagger slightly, and Martha moved quickly to steady her while still holding baby Samuel. "Blackwood," Margaret whispered. "Thomas told me he'd settled all that business before we left St. Louis. Seems your husband wasn't entirely honest about his financial arrangements." Coleman spoke for the first time since entering the cabin, his voice carrying the dry rasp of a man who had seen too much of human nature's darker aspects. Joseph studied Margaret's face as the implications sank in. He could see the moment when she realized that Thomas, the man she had loved and trusted completely, had hidden a truth that now threatened everything she had fought to protect. "What exactly did the papers say?" Ezra asked, his medical training having taught him to gather facts before making diagnoses. Garrett reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age and handling. "Legal and binding contract. Thomas O'Sullivan borrowed $800 from Mr. Blackwood for what he called business investments. When the investments failed, he couldn't repay the principal or the accumulated interest." $800? Margaret's voice was barely audible. "That's impossible. We never had that kind of money, never needed to borrow such an amount." "Gambling debts have a way of growing," Coleman observed. "Man starts small, loses a little, borrows to win it back. Before he knows it, he's deeper than he ever imagined." The young bounty hunter, who had given his name as Pete Morrison, shifted uncomfortably in his corner. "Maybe we should just take what they got and call it even," he suggested. "These folks ain't got enough to make this worth our trouble." Garrett's expression turned dangerous. "Blackwood don't work that way, boy. He made it clear. Bring back the woman and children, or don't bother coming back at all." Joseph felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Cyrus Blackwood wasn't just a creditor. He was someone with enough power and ruthlessness to send armed men hundreds of miles to collect on a debt. That suggested either organized crime or political connections that made defying him extremely dangerous. "What does Blackwood want with them?" Joseph asked. "Women can work in one of his establishments until the debt's paid," Garrett explained, with casual cruelty. "Children can be placed with families who need extra hands, good honest work for everyone." The euphemisms didn't disguise reality. Margaret would be forced into prostitution while her children disappeared into a form of indentured servitude that might last their entire lives. Joseph had seen enough of frontier justice to know that people who crossed men like Blackwood rarely lived long enough to regret it. Outside, a wolf howled close enough to the cabin that everyone inside could hear the individual notes of its call. The sound was answered by others, creating a chorus that spoke of a large pack gathering in the storm. "They're getting bolder," Martha observed, moving to check the shutters over the windows. "Wolves don't usually approach buildings with this. Many people inside. Storm's got them desperate," Coleman replied. "They can smell the horses, probably haven't eaten in days. Desperate animals do things they wouldn't normally consider." Joseph understood that Coleman wasn't just talking about wolves. The bounty hunters were desperate too, men who had traveled far from home in dangerous weather, pursuing a job that might be their last chance at the money they needed to survive. That desperation made them more dangerous than simple greed would have. As the night deepened, an uneasy routine developed in the cramped cabin. Martha prepared a simple meal from their combined supplies, carefully rationing food that might need to last for days if the storm continued. Margaret fed the babies, while trying to keep Mary calm and quiet. The men took turns watching the windows and doors, listening for signs that the wolves might be preparing to test the cabin's defenses. It was during one of these quiet moments that Pete Morrison approached Joseph near the fireplace. The young man moved carefully, his hands visible and his weapon conspicuously set aside. "Can I ask you something?" Pete said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Joseph nodded, curious about what the youngest bounty hunter wanted to discuss privately. "You really pull them folks out of that ravine like Garrett. Says, woman and 3 babies, 4 days without food or shelter?" "That's right," Joseph confirmed. Pete was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "I got a baby sister back home, Sarah's age, maybe a little older. Been thinking about how I'd feel if someone was hunting her through a storm like this." Joseph sensed an opportunity, but knew he had to proceed carefully. "What's your story, Pete? How'd you end up riding with men like Garrett and Coleman?" The young man's face twisted with pain and regret. "Lost my pa's farm to the bank last spring. Ma's sick, needs medicine we can't afford. Garrett offered good money for this job, said it was just collecting on a legitimate debt. And now I'm thinking maybe I didn't ask the right questions before I agreed to hunt down a woman and babies." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main door. One of the wolves had apparently tried to test the wooden barrier, leaving scratch marks in the wood and causing everyone inside to grab for their weapons. "They're getting hungry enough to take real risks," Ezra observed, checking the bar that secured the door. "How long do storms like this usually last?" Margaret asked, bouncing Samuel gently to keep him from crying. "Could be hours, could be days," Martha replied. "This time of year the weather can change fast, but when it settles in like this—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that they might be trapped together for an extended period, with limited food, growing tension, and dangerous predators waiting outside. As the hours passed, Joseph noticed subtle changes in the dynamics inside the cabin. Pete continued to distance himself from his companions, spending more time helping Martha with domestic tasks than watching the prisoners. Coleman remained watchful, but seemed less focused on immediate violence, perhaps recognizing that their situation required cooperation to survive. But Garrett was growing more agitated as the night wore on. He paced the small space like a caged animal, muttering about schedules and contracts and the consequences of failing to complete their mission on time. "Blackwood ain't gonna understand delays," he said to Coleman during one of his restless circuits around the room. "He's expecting us back in St. Louis with the merchandise by the end of the month." "Merchandise?" Margaret repeated, her voice sharp with anger. "Is that what we are to you? What are my children?" Garrett turned to face her with eyes that held no warmth or human sympathy. "You're what you've always been, lady, collateral for your husband's poor decisions. Difference is, now you get to pay for them." The casual cruelty in his voice seemed to catalyze something in Joseph. He had spent years walking between worlds, trying to find peaceful solutions to conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve. But some situations called for clarity rather than diplomacy. "Garrett," Joseph said quietly, his voice carrying a tone that made everyone in the cabin pay attention. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about having a job to finish." "What about it? I'm wondering if you've considered what happens when men like you disappear in a country like this. Who comes looking for you? Who cares enough to track down what happened?" The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Garrett's face darkened with anger and something that might have been fear. "You're threatening me, Redskin?" Joseph smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. "I'm explaining facts. You're a long way from St. Louis, Garrett. Long way from anyone who might care what happens to you out here." Coleman spoke before Garrett could respond, his voice carrying the authority. Of experience. Everybody calm down. We got bigger problems than settling scores right now. He was right. Outside, the wolves had grown quiet. Not the reassuring quiet of predators moving away, but the ominous silence that preceded an organized attack. The pack had apparently decided that the humans inside the cabin represented prey worth the risk of confrontation. "They're planning something," Martha said, checking the shutters again. "When wolves go quiet like this, it usually means they're coordinating." As if summoned by her words, the first attack came. Not against the doors or windows, but against the cabin's weakest point. The wolves had found the gap where the chimney met the roof, and they were trying to widen it enough to gain entry from above. The sound of claws scrabbling against stone and wood filled the cabin, accompanied by growls and snarls that spoke of intelligent predators working together toward a common goal. "They're trying to get through the roof," Ezra said, grabbing a poker from beside the fireplace. "If they manage to break through—" He didn't need to complete the thought. 9 people trapped in a confined space with desperate wolves dropping from above would face a massacre that would leave no survivors to tell the story. Joseph moved toward the fireplace, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether any of them lived to see dawn. Dawn came slowly to the Colorado Territory, filtering through storm clouds that were finally beginning to break apart after their night of fury. The wolf pack had withdrawn with the first pale light, melting back into the forest as silently as they had appeared, leaving behind only tracks in the snow and claw marks on the cabin walls as evidence of their visit. Inside the cramped shelter, 9 people stirred from an uneasy night where true sleep had been impossible for anyone. Weapons had remained within reach, eyes had stayed watchful, and every sound from outside had been analyzed for potential threat or opportunity. Now, as natural light replaced the flickering glow of the fire, the temporary truce imposed by wolves, and weather was coming to an end. Joseph had spent the darkest hours of the night watching and thinking, studying the faces of his companions and adversaries in the dying firelight. Billy Watts had dozed fitfully, his rifle clutched protectively against his chest, his young face troubled even in sleep. Tom Bradshaw had remained awake and alert, but Joseph had noticed subtle changes in the older gunfighter's demeanor. Professional reconsidering the ethics of his current employment. Wade Garrett, however, had shown no signs of wavering. If anything, the night of forced proximity to his quarry had hardened his resolve. He sat near the door now, checking his weapons with methodical precision and studying Margaret and her children with the cold calculation of a man planning to collect valuable property. As the children began to wake and make the small sounds that meant they would soon need food and attention, Margaret looked around the cabin with eyes that held no illusions about their situation. The brief respite was over, and decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether her family lived in freedom or bondage. "Storm's breaking," Garrett announced unnecessarily, as if his observation somehow gave him authority over what would happen next. "Time to finish our business." Ezra moved closer to Margaret, positioning himself between her and the bounty hunters in a gesture of protection that was both brave and futile. "The business you're talking about is human trafficking. That's a federal crime, regardless of what papers you think you have." Garrett produced the debt document again, unfolding it with theatrical precision. "This here's a legal contract, signed and witnessed proper. Mrs. O'Sullivan and her children belong to my client until the debt paid, in full." Martha had been examining the document periodically throughout the night, her sharp eyes noting details that others might miss. Now she spoke with the authority of someone who had dealt with legal matters in her previous life. "This contract has several problems," she said firmly. "First, it's dated after Colorado became a territory, but it references Missouri law regarding debt collection. Second, the witness signatures appear to be in the same handwriting as the borrower's signature. Third, there's no territorial seal or registration number which would be required for any debt instrument of this size. Garrett's confident expression flickered for just a moment. You saying you're some kind of lawyer, lady? I'm saying I've seen enough fraudulent documents to recognize one, Martha replied. And I'm saying that any territorial judge worth his appointment would throw this out of court in 5 minutes. Joseph watched the exchange with growing hope. If Martha was right about the document's legal problems, it might provide the leverage. They needed to resolve the situation without bloodshed, but convincing armed men to abandon a profitable enterprise based on legal technicalities would require more than just logical arguments. Billy Watts had been listening to the conversation with obvious distress. Now he cleared his throat nervously and addressed his leader. Wade, maybe we should think about this, if the lady's right about the papers being fake. The papers are fine, Garrett snapped, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Thornfield wouldn't send us out here with worthless documents, wouldn't he? Joseph asked quietly. Think about it, Garrett. You're expendable to a man like Thornfield. If this goes bad, if you end up arrested for kidnapping or worse, do you really think he's going to risk his reputation to help you? The psychological pressure was working. Joseph could see doubt creeping into the faces of all 3 bounty hunters as they considered the possibility that they had been set up to take legal risks while their employer remained safely distant from any consequences. Tom Bradshaw voiced what the others were thinking. Wade, I've worked for plenty of wealthy men over the years. They all got one thing in common. When trouble comes, they protect themselves first and worry about their hired. Help later. Margaret seized on the growing uncertainty among their captors. I remember Magnus Thornfield from St. Louis, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. He was known for using forged documents to steal property from families who couldn't afford lawyers to fight him. Thomas quit his job rather than help with one of Thornfield's schemes. That's why this is personal for him, Joseph added, connecting the final pieces of the puzzle. Your husband cost Thornfield money by exposing his illegal activities. This isn't about collecting a debt, it's about revenge. The revelation hit Billy Watts like a physical blow. Jesus, Wade, we're not debt collectors. We're helping some rich man get revenge on a dead man's family. Money's still money, Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. And we got our orders. Orders based on forged papers to commit federal crimes, Martha pointed out. How much is Thornfield paying you for this job? $500, Billy answered before Garrett could stop him. Split 3 ways. Joseph did quick mental arithmetic. So you're risking federal prison sentences for less than $200 each? To help a rich man get revenge on babies who never hurt anyone? The moral and practical arguments were finally overwhelming the bounty hunters' resistance. Billy was openly troubled. Tom was clearly re-evaluating the wisdom of their mission, and even Garrett was beginning to show signs of doubt. But it was Mary who provided the decisive moment. The toddler had been watching the adults with the serious attention that children bring to conversations they don't understand, but somehow sense are important. Now she slipped away from Margaret and walked unsteadily toward Billy Watts, her small hand reaching out to touch his rifle. Bang, she asked innocently, the way any curious child might inquire about an unfamiliar object. Billy instinctively moved the weapon away from her reach, his paternal instincts overriding his professional obligations. No, sweetheart. Not for little. Girls. Mary smiled at him with the trusting openness that only very young children possess, then reached up with both arms in the universal gesture that meant she wanted to be picked up. The hardened gunman found himself lifting the tiny girl, holding her awkwardly as she examined his face with frank curiosity. Mary reached out and touched his beard, giggling at the rough texture. "Daddy?" she asked hopefully. The single word shattered Billy's remaining resolve. With tears streaming down his weathered face, he gently returned Mary to her mother and turned to face his companions. "I can't do this, Wade. I got kids of my own, and I can't be part of destroying somebody else's family for money." Tom Bradshaw nodded slowly. "Kid's right. This whole job stinks from top to bottom. I'm out too." Garrett found himself alone, facing 6 adults and 3 children, with only his own weapons and determination to sustain him. For a moment, Joseph thought the man might try to complete his mission through violence, regardless of the odds against him. But Garrett was a practical man above all else. Outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by his own men, he had no realistic chance of success. Moreover, the legal foundation for his mission was crumbling under scrutiny, leaving him vulnerable to prosecution if he continued. "This ain't over," Garrett said finally, holstering his weapon. "Thornfield ain't gonna give up just because we turned back once." "Maybe not," Joseph agreed. "But the next time he sends someone, they'll be operating under territorial law with proper legal oversight. And Mrs. O'Sullivan will have time to find lawyers who can challenge that fraudulent contract in court." Garrett gathered his gear with the angry movements of a man frustrated by circumstances beyond his control. "You people don't know who you're messing with. Thornfield's got money, influence, connections. He'll find a way to get what he wants." "Then he'll have to do it legally," Ezra said firmly, "and with proper documentation that can withstand scrutiny." As the 3 bounty hunters prepared to leave, Billy Watts approached Margaret one final time. "Mom, I'm sorry about all this. I got caught up in something I didn't understand, and I hope you can forgive me." Margaret looked at the young man, who had been prepared to help destroy her family just minutes earlier, and somehow found compassion in her heart. "You have children of your own, Mr. Watts. Remember this day when you make decisions that might affect other people's children." Billy nodded solemnly and followed his former companions out into the morning light, leaving behind a cabin full of people who had survived not just wolves and weather, but the darker predators that walked on 2 legs and used law and money as weapons. As the sound of departing horses faded into the distance, Margaret found herself crying, not from fear or despair, but from relief so profound it felt like physical pain. Her children were safe, at least for now, and she was surrounded by people who had risked their lives to protect complete strangers. Joseph stood by the window, watching the bounty hunters disappear into the forest and thinking about the challenges that still lay ahead. Thornfield would indeed try again, probably with better legal preparation and more determined operatives. Margaret and her children would need ongoing protection, legal representation, and a secure place to build new lives away from their enemies' reach. But for now, in this moment, they were free. The stars that had guided Joseph to find them in the ravine had continued to watch over them through their darkest night, and the dawn brought not just light, but the promise of hope. Martha busied herself preparing breakfast for their expanded household, while Ezra examined the children to ensure their night of stress hadn't caused any physical setbacks. The domestic normalcy felt surreal after the tension of the previous hours, but it also pointed toward a possible future. One where Margaret and her children might find the family and security they had lost. Joseph made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. These people had become more than a rescue mission or a temporary responsibility. They had become something he had never expected to find, a family worth protecting, a purpose worth pursuing, a reason to believe that his vision of standing between 2 worlds might serve a greater good than he had ever imagined. As the sun climbed higher and the last traces of the storm clouds disappeared, Joseph began planning not just for Margaret's immediate safety, but for a future where she and her children could live without fear, where the bonds forged in crisis could grow into something lasting and meaningful. The story that had begun with death and desperation in a ravine was transformed into something else entirely. A tale of found family, unexpected alliances, and the power of ordinary people to protect what matters most against forces that seemed overwhelming. But Joseph knew that the real challenges were just beginning. Building a safe future would require everything they had learned about courage, resourcefulness, and the strength that comes from refusing to give up on the people you love. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the Hoffman's cabin, Margaret O'Sullivan stood in the doorway of what had once been a storage shed and was now being transformed into a home. The building sat on the grounds of Joseph's uncle's trading post, 20 miles south of where her ordeal had begun, and it represented the first permanent shelter she had known since Thomas's death. The transformation of the shed into living quarters had been a community effort that revealed the true character of the people who had chosen to help her. Joseph worked alongside his uncle, Matonagian, Standing Bear, cutting windows and reinforcing walls with the methodical precision of men who understood that strong shelter meant the difference between survival and tragedy in frontier territory. Martha Hoffman had proven to be as skilled with carpentry as she was with healing, fashioning furniture from rough lumber and creating storage solutions that maximized the limited space. Ezra contributed his medical expertise by designing ventilation that would prevent the respiratory ailments that plagued poorly constructed frontier dwellings. But it was Winyan Waste, good woman, Standing Bear's wife, who had truly made Margaret feel welcome. The older Lakota woman had lost her own children to disease 15 years earlier, and she approached Margaret's babies with a combination of joy and gentle sorrow that spoke of wounds that had healed but never truly disappeared. "Hoxie Chikala," she would murmur as she held the twins, using the Lakota words for little ones that somehow conveyed more tenderness than any English equivalent. Mary had taken to following Winyan Waste everywhere, chattering in the mixture of English and Dakota words she was rapidly acquiring. The trading post itself occupied a strategic position at the confluence of two streams, where travelers following different routes through the mountains naturally converged. Standing Bear had built his business by offering fair prices, honest dealing, and neutral ground where people of different backgrounds could trade safely. The post served whites, Native Americans, and the growing population of mixed-blood families that were becoming increasingly common in the territories. Joseph had spent the 3 weeks since the cabin incident dividing his time between construction work and longer absences that Margaret gradually understood were intelligence-gathering missions. He was tracking Magnus Thornfield's activities, monitoring legal developments in St. Louis, and building a network of allies who could provide early warning if new threats emerged. On this particular morning, he had returned from a 5-day journey to Fort Collins with news that would shape their next decisions. "Thornfield not giving up," Joseph reported, as the adults gathered around Martha's kitchen table. "But he's being more careful about how he proceeds." Margaret felt the familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. What's he doing now? He's hired legitimate lawyers this time, real ones, with proper credentials and territorial authority. They're filing papers claiming that your husband's homestead belongs to Thornfield by right of foreclosure, and they're demanding that territorial officials locate you for questioning about the property transfer. Ezra frowned as he considered the implications. That's a more sophisticated approach than forged debt contracts, harder to fight too. But not impossible, Martha added. Property law requires proper notification of foreclosure proceedings. If Thomas never received legal notice, and if Margaret can prove she had no knowledge of the alleged debt, then any foreclosure would be invalid. Joseph nodded. That's what I was hoping you'd say. But there's another problem. Thornfield's investigators have traced our movements from the original homestead to this area. They know Margaret and the children are somewhere in this region, and they're putting pressure on territorial officials to issue warrants for questioning. Standing Bear spoke for the first time, his English accented but precise. Warrants are papers. Papers have no power in places where law does not reach. The older man's meaning was clear. The trading post existed in a legal grey area where territorial authority was theoretical rather than practical. As long as Margaret remained here, she would be relatively safe from official interference. But such protection came at the cost of isolation from the broader world and the legitimate opportunities it might offer her children. Winyan Waste listened to the conversation while nursing Samuel, who had developed a preference for her over all other caregivers except his mother. "The Wasichu with his papers seeks to steal children," she said quietly. "This is not new. We have seen this before." Her words carried the weight of historical experience that the others could only imagine. The systematic theft of native children by government officials and religious organizations was an ongoing tragedy throughout the territories, justified by legal documents and bureaucratic procedures that made cruelty seem legitimate. Margaret understood that her situation, while unique in its details, was part of a larger pattern of powerful interests using law as a weapon against vulnerable families. The realization was both frightening and oddly comforting. She was not alone in facing such threats, and she was surrounded by people who had learned to resist them. "What are our options?" she asked, looking around the table at faces that had become more familiar than any she had known since leaving St. Louis. Joseph had clearly been thinking about this question during his journey. "We can fight the legal battle, but that means exposing you to official scrutiny while the case proceeds. We can keep you hidden here, but that limits your children's futures. Or we can take a third path, which is, we will make you disappear completely. New names, new location, new lives so far from Thornfield's reach that he'll eventually give up the chase." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the fire, beautiful and insubstantial, and carrying the promise of both freedom and loss. Margaret would gain safety for her children, but at the cost of everything that connected them to their father's memory and their legitimate inheritance. "The homestead Thomas built," she said slowly. "Everything we worked for together. It would all just belong to Thornfield? Property can be replaced," Martha said gently. "Children cannot." Mary chose that moment to run into the room, chattering excitedly about something she had discovered outside. She climbed onto Margaret's lap and began describing a bird's nest she had found, her words tumbling over each other in the way of children who have important news to share. Looking at her daughter's animated face, Margaret realized that Mary had no memory of the homestead, no attachment to the life that had existed before their ordeal. For the children, home was not a place, but the people who cared for them. Thomas's legacy was not the cabin he had built, but the love he had shown and the values he had tried to instill. "If we chose new identities," Margaret asked, "would we have to leave here? Leave all of you?" Joseph and his uncle exchanged a look that spoke of conversations Margaret had not been privy to. It was Standing Bear who answered. "My nephew has spoken much of his vision quest, of the path the spirits showed him. He believes his destiny is to stand between worlds, to help lost souls find their way home." The older man's eyes crinkled with what might have been amusement. Perhaps the spirits meant for him to find his own home as well. The meaning behind his words became clear as Joseph leaned forward, his expression serious but hopeful. "I've been thinking about this for weeks, Margaret. About what it means to build a life worth protecting." Margaret felt her heart begin to race, though she wasn't sure whether from hope or fear. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you're willing, if you think you could be happy here, we could become a family in truth as well as circumstance. Not just for protection, though that would be part of it, but because— He paused, searching for words to express something he had never expected to feel. Because I love you and your children, and I can't imagine a future without you in it. The proposal was both shocking and inevitable, the logical conclusion of everything that had happened since Joseph first heard her voice calling from the ravine. Margaret looked around the table at faces that had become dear to her, at the woman who had become a grandmother to her children, at the man who had risked everything to save them from both natural disasters and human predators. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know that you kept 3 babies alive at the bottom of a canyon when anyone else would have given up," Joseph replied. "I know that you face impossible odds with courage that puts warriors to shame. I know that your children smile when they see me coming, and that makes me want to be worthy of their trust." Outside, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Joseph was instantly alert, moving to the window with the fluid grace of someone always prepared for danger. 3 riders, he reported. Coming fast, but not like they're fleeing something. Professional pace, not panic. Standing, Bear rose and reached for the rifle that always hung near the door. "Expected or unexpected?" "Unexpected," Joseph replied grimly, "but that doesn't necessarily mean hostile." As the riders entered the clearing around the trading post, Joseph felt a mixture of relief and concern. He recognized the lead rider as Captain James Morrison of the Territorial Militia, a man whose integrity was respected even by those who disagreed with his politics. The 2 men with him wore civilian clothes but carried themselves with military bearing. Morrison dismounted and approached the trading post with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that he was entering neutral ground, where his authority was limited by diplomacy rather than law. "Mr. Crow Feather," he called out, "I'm hoping we can have a conversation about some mutual concerns." Joseph stepped outside, keeping his weapon visible but not threatening. "Captain Morrison, what brings you this far into the mountains?" "A matter involving a widow named Margaret O'Sullivan and some very persistent lawyers from St. Louis," Morrison replied. "I'm hoping you might know something about that situation." Captain James Morrison's weathered face bore the expression of a man carrying news that was both complex and consequential. As he stood in the main room of the trading post, his hat respectfully removed and his weapons clearly visible but unthreatening, the assembled group waited for him to explain his unexpected arrival. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Morrison began, addressing Margaret directly, "I've ridden a considerable distance to speak with you about a legal matter that affects not just your family, but the territorial government's ability to maintain order and justice." Margaret felt Joseph move closer to her, a subtle shift that communicated protection without appearing hostile to their visitor. Mary clung to her mother's skirt, sensing the adult tension even if she couldn't understand its source. "What legal matter?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that Morrison's words had awakened. Morrison reached into his coat and produced a thick envelope sealed with official wax. 3 days ago, I received this communication from the Territorial. At Capitol, it contains a federal warrant for your arrest, issued at the request of one Magnus Thornfield, charging you with theft of property and unlawful flight to avoid civil judgment. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. A federal warrant meant that she could be arrested anywhere in the territories and forcibly returned to St. Louis to face charges that Thornfield had fabricated. It meant that the legal protection of distance and jurisdictional confusion had been stripped away. "That's impossible," Martha interjected. "The debt contract was fraudulent. We proved that." Morrison nodded grimly. "The contract you're referring to was indeed questionable, but Mr. Thornfield has since produced additional documentation, property transfer records, territorial registration forms, and witness statements that appear to be legitimate." Joseph felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. He's had 3 weeks to manufacture better forgeries. Money can buy very convincing false documents, especially when the people who might verify them are hundreds of miles away. That's precisely what concerns me, Morrison said. Mr. Thornfield has also made it clear that he has influential friends in the territorial government, people who are prepared to support his claims regardless of their actual merit. Standing Bear spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had observed government corruption for decades. You speak of concerns, Captain, but you carry the warrant. What is your purpose here? Morrison looked directly at the older man, recognizing both the challenge and the wisdom in his question. My purpose is to warn Mrs. O'Sullivan that she has perhaps 2 days before federal marshals arrive to execute this warrant, and to offer her an alternative that might serve justice better than blind obedience to corrupted legal processes. The suggestion of official misconduct hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. Morrison was essentially admitting that he believed the warrant was based on fraudulent evidence, but he was also acknowledging the limits of his own authority to prevent its execution. What alternative? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. You disappear, Morrison said simply. Tonight, if possible. Far enough away that even federal marshals will have difficulty tracking you. I will report that you were gone when we arrived, that you must have received warning and fled deeper into the mountains. Ezra leaned forward, his medical training making him naturally suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. Captain, why would you risk your career to help someone you've never met? Morrison's expression grew harder, revealing depths of anger that his professional demeanor had concealed. Because I have a daughter, Dr. Hoffman. She's about Mrs. O'Sullivan's age, with 2 small children of her own. If some wealthy bastard decided to destroy her family for his own twisted purposes, I would hope that somewhere, someone with the power to help would choose to do the right thing instead of the legal thing. The personal revelation transformed Morrison from an official representative into a father and protector, someone whose motivations Margaret could understand completely. She looked around the room at the faces of people who had already risked so much to help her, and she saw the same protective instinct reflected in their expressions. If we run, she said slowly, what happens to all of you? Thornfield will know that someone warned us, someone helped us escape. He'll retaliate. Joseph had been considering this problem since Morrison's arrival. Not if we're smart about it. Captain, how many people know about your mission here? Just myself and these 2 men, Morrison replied, indicating his companions, both of whom share my concerns about federal authority being used to settle personal vendettas. Then, as far as anyone knows, you followed proper procedure and found an empty trading post. We had already departed for parts unknown, possibly heading toward California or Oregon territory. Standing Bear smiled at his nephew's tactical thinking. And if investigators come later, they will find that we know nothing of any widow or children. We are simple traders who deal with many travelers, whose names we do not ask, and whose destinations we do not know. The plan was forming with the rapid efficiency of people accustomed to making life or death decisions under pressure. But Margaret felt overwhelmed by the scope of what was being proposed. Running meant leaving behind not just the trading post that had become home, but any chance of legally reclaiming her husband's property or living openly under her real name. Where would we go? She asked. How would we live? Joseph moved to a map that hung on the wall, pointing to a region northwest of their current location. There's a valley about 60 miles from here, hidden between 2 mountain ridges. Good water, game, soil that could support farming. It's technically unclaimed territory, too remote for official surveys, too difficult to reach for casual settlement. It sounds lonely, Margaret observed. It would be, Joseph admitted, but lonely and free is better than being captive and surrounded by people. Winion Waste spoke for the first time since Morrison's arrival, her words carrying the weight of experience with forced displacement. Loneliness ends when children grow and find their own paths. Captivity may never end. The wisdom in her observation was undeniable. Margaret's children would eventually need to interact with the broader world, to receive education and find opportunities for their own futures. But they could only do so safely if they first survived the immediate threat that Thornfield represented. Morrison checked his pocket watch and looked toward the windows, where afternoon light was beginning to fade. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I can give you until tomorrow morning to make your decision. After that, I'll have to follow official procedures regardless of my personal feelings." "I've already decided," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We'll go tonight." The next few hours passed in a blur of controlled urgency. Supplies were gathered and packed with careful attention to weight and necessity. Clothing, food, medical supplies, tools, and weapons were selected based on their essential nature and portability. Everything else, furniture, books, sentimental items, would have to be left behind. Martha proved invaluable in preparing medical supplies that could handle everything from childhood fevers to serious injuries. Ezra contributed his knowledge of wilderness medicine, while Standing Bear selected tools and weapons that would be essential for establishing a homestead in truly isolated territory. Joseph spent time with his uncle discussing the practical aspects of completely disappearing from official records. They would need new names, plausible backgrounds, and the ability to trade for necessities without drawing attention to their true identities. As evening approached, Margaret found herself alone, with the children, helping them understand that they were going on another journey to a new home. Mary accepted the explanation with the adaptability of childhood, while the twins were too young to comprehend anything beyond the immediate disruption to their routine. "We are going to live in the mountains," Margaret told Mary as she packed the child's few possessions. "With Joseph and Uncle Bear and Grandmother Winion Waste. Would you like that?" Mary nodded solemnly. "Joseph is my papa now." The question caught Margaret off guard, forcing her to confront decisions she had been avoiding. Joseph's marriage proposal remained unanswered, complicated by circumstances that made it impossible to know whether her feelings were genuine or simply gratitude mixed with desperation. "Joseph loves us," Margaret said carefully, "and we love him. Sometimes that's how families begin." As darkness settled over the trading post, the departure preparations reached their final stages. Horses were saddled, supplies were secured, and routes were planned that would take them into territory so remote that even determined pursuers would struggle to follow. Captain Morrison appeared one final time as they prepared to leave, carrying a leather pouch that he pressed into Margaret's hands. "Travel funds," he explained when she tried to refuse. "From citizens who believe in justice, even when the law fails to provide it." The pouch was surprisingly heavy, containing enough gold coins to sustain a family for months, if used carefully. Margaret felt tears threatening as she realized that Morrison had not just risked his career, but had also organized financial support from people she would never meet. "Why?" she asked. "Why would strangers help us like this?" Morrison's expression softened. "Because most people have children they love, Mrs. O'Sullivan, and because sometimes the only way to preserve what's good in this world is to protect it from what's corrupt." The final farewell was brief and emotional. Standing Bear and Winion Waste would remain at the trading post, providing cover for their disappearance and maintaining the business that served as their front. Martha and Ezra had decided to accompany the fugitive family, at least until they were safely established in their new location. As the small group rode away from the trading post under a canopy of stars, Margaret looked back only once. The building that had sheltered them was already fading into darkness, becoming part of a life that she was leaving behind forever. Joseph rode beside her, leading a pack-horse loaded with supplies and carrying Samuel in a sling across his chest. Martha and Ezra followed, their own horses heavily laden with medical equipment and personal possessions. Mary rode with Margaret, chattering quietly about the stars and asking when they would reach their new home. The journey took 3 days of careful travel through terrain that grew progressively more rugged and isolated. They followed game trails and stream beds, avoiding established routes where they might encounter other travelers. Joseph's knowledge of the country proved invaluable as he led them through passes that didn't appear on any map and down valleys that seemed untouched by human presence. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they reached their destination, a hidden valley perhaps 5 miles long and 2 miles wide, surrounded by peaks that rose like cathedral spires against the endless sky. A stream ran down the center of the valley, fed by snowmelt and springs that would provide year-round water. Aspen groves dotted the landscape, and the meadows showed signs of rich soil beneath the prairie grass. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, and for the first time in weeks she felt something that might have been peace. Joseph helped her down from her horse and pointed toward a cluster of trees near the stream. "Good place for a cabin there. Protected from wind, close to water, good drainage." As they made camp that first night in their new home, Margaret realized that her answer to Joseph's marriage proposal had been given not in words, but in actions. She had chosen to trust him with her life and her children's futures. She had chosen to build something new rather than mourn what had been lost. 6 months later, a substantial cabin stood where Joseph had pointed, surrounded by gardens that Winyan Waste would have been proud to see. Martha and Ezra had built their own smaller dwelling nearby, creating a community of mutual support in the wilderness. The children thrived in the mountain air and freedom. Mary had learned to identify dozens of plants and animals, while the twins grew strong and healthy under the care of their extended family. Samuel had taken his first steps in the cabin doorway, while Sarah spoke her first words while sitting in Joseph's lap by the fire. Margaret and Joseph had married in a ceremony that blended Christian and Lakota traditions, witnessed by Martha and Ezra and blessed by the mountains that surrounded their hidden valley. Their wedding rings were carved from local wood, and their vows were spoken under stars that had guided them through their darkest hours. Letters occasionally reached them through carefully maintained connections, bringing news of the outside world. Magnus Thornfield had eventually given up his pursuit, frustrated by the complete disappearance of his quarry and the lack of cooperation from territorial officials. The forged warrants had been quietly withdrawn when their fraudulent nature became impossible to hide. But these developments mattered less than the daily reality of a life built on love, hard work, and the determination to protect what was precious. Margaret O'Sullivan had become Margaret Crow Feather, and her children had gained not just a new father, but a new understanding of what family could mean. On winter evenings, as they sat around their fire with the wind howling through the peaks above them, Joseph would sometimes tell the story of the night the stars spoke to him, guiding him to a ravine where 4 souls waited to be saved. The children would listen with wide eyes, marveling at the idea that the same stars that shone down on their safe, warm home had once conspired to bring their family together, and Margaret would look around at the faces lit by firelight. Her husband, her children, the friends who had become family, and understand finally that home was not a place, but a collection of hearts that had chosen to beat in harmony, protected by love, and blessed by stars that watched over those who refused to surrender hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.